The letter arrived on a morning so quiet it felt unfinished, the kind of quiet my mother used to respect. I almost threw it away with the rest of the mail. Never imagining it carried a number that would reopen every sealed room of my childhood. I had already buried my mother by the time everyone agreed there was nothing left to sort through. She died in the small house at the edge of town, the one with the sagging porch and the frostbitten mailbox, leaving behind silence, a few worn quilts, and a reputation for having gotten by. That's what my family said, anyway. I believed them, until the bank letter arrived and told a different story. The kettle hadn't started whistling yet, but the house already felt awake. Eekok. Morning light pressed softly against the kitchen window, pale and unsure, like it didn't want to disturb anything. That was when I noticed the envelope, sitting apart from the rest of the mail, heavier somehow, as if it knew it didn't belong. I stood there longer than I needed to, just listening to the room breathe. My mother's kitchen never rushed anyone. Shanash was gone. Even after she was gone, it kept the same habits, slow, careful, quiet. The linoleum floor still dipped near the sink. The curtains still held the faint smell of laundry soap and winter air. Nothing had moved since the day we came back from the funeral. The mail was stacked near the door where she always left it, grocery flyers, a folded newspaper, an overdue catalog she'd never order from, ordinary things. Then there was the envelope, cream-colored, thick paper, the kind that doesn't bend easily, addressed in a neat, formal hand, no nickname, no warmth. Just my name, written the way institutions write it. My mother never liked official mail. She said it always arrived with its shoes already on. I picked it up, then set it back down. Went to the stove, filled the kettle, turned the flame low. The radiator clicked behind me, steady and patient, like it had something to say, but all the time in the world. I leaned against the counter and waited for the water to heat, staring at the small crack above the doorway my father once promised to fix. The envelope waited. I told myself it was probably nothing, some notice, some leftover paperwork nobody bothered to close. People said she didn't leave much behind, just the house, some bills, a life that had been stretched thin but never torn. I believed them, and when the coffee finally poured, it was too hot to drink. I wrapped my hands around the mug anyway. Let the steam fog my glasses, let the seconds pass, then I opened the envelope. The paper inside was clean and sharp, folded with precision, no letter, explanation. Just a balance sheet printed in black ink that didn't hesitate. My eyes skimmed it once, then again. Oh yeah, I felt something tighten in my chest. Not panic, not excitement, just confusion. There was a number printed near the bottom, larger than anything I expected to see tied to my mother's name. I read it a third time, slowly. $84,200. I waited for the meaning to catch up. It didn't. The radiator knocked again. A car passed outside. Somewhere, a door closed. The world continued unconcerned. I sat down at the kitchen table where my mother used to sort coupons and stack envelopes by due date. The chair creaked like it recognized me. The paper felt stiff between my fingers, impersonal, almost cold. This wasn't how her life looked. My mother counted coins before grocery trips. She reused envelopes until the corners softened. She once drove across town to save $3 on winter boots. She talked about money the way people talk about weather, only when necessary, never with detail. Yeah, lights on, she'd say. That's what matters. That's what ma had a ma. Lights on, she'd say. That's what matters. I folded the paper once, then again, carefully. Like if I rushed, it might tear. I tried to picture her at the bank. At my mother standing in line, purse held close, coat buttoned too tight, speaking softly to a teller who didn't know her stories, signing her name in that small, precise handwriting I recognized from permission slips and recipe cards. She never mentioned it. Not once. There were no hints, no slips of pride, no warnings, just silence, practiced and clean. I thought of all the evenings she sat across from me at this same table, steam rising from soup bowls, the radio low. How she asked about my day but never hers. How she brushed off questions with half smiles. You worry too much, she'd say. I wondered how long she'd been keeping this, how many months, how many years. I wondered if she ever almost told me. Stood in a doorway with the words ready, then decided against it. The number on the page didn't feel like a gift. It felt like a locked room I just stepped into. I folded the paper one last time and slid it back into the envelope. My hands were steady, but something inside me had shifted quietly. This wasn't about money, it was about choice. She had chosen not to be seen this way. I placed the envelope back on the table, the rest lay back attached, lining it up with the wood grain like she used to do with everything. Outside, the light had changed, brighter now, more certain, the coffee had gone cold. I didn't open any more mail that morning. I washed the mug, dried it, put it back in the cabinet she always used. The envelope stayed where it was, waiting. And for the first time since she died, I felt like my mother had just said something important. Not with words, Inast, but with the space she left behind. The church was colder than it needed to be. Uncarved. Not from the weather, just from the way sound disappeared once it rose too high. Voices stayed low there. Shoes whispered against the floor. Even grief seemed to know better than to speak loudly. I stood near the back, coat still buttoned, the bank letter folded inside my pocket. It pressed against my side the entire time, warm from my body, heavy with something no one else could see. Cow. The funeral smelled like old wood and lilies that had opened too early. Light slipped through the stained glass in thin colors that never quite touched the pews. In never qua, harapan. My mother's photograph sat at the front, one I barely recognized, too formal, too still. Relatives filled the rows in quiet pieces. People I hadn't seen in years leaned toward each other, trading small observations like currency. Who had driven how far? How thin she'd gotten at the end, how quickly things happened. I listened without joining. My aunt found me before the service started. She always smelled like hand lotion and cold air. She took my arm the way people do when they think you might fall apart. Well, she said softly, not looking at me. At least she didn't leave much to deal with. Ah! She gave my arm a squeeze. Reassuring. Certain. Just memories, she added. And a few bills. I nodded. That seemed to be the sentence everyone agreed on. I felt the letter shift in my pocket when I moved. A small reminder, a quiet contradiction. After the service, people gathered in the narrow hall beside the sanctuary. Coffee was poured into thin cups. Cookies sat untouched on paper plates. Conversations unfolded in murmurs, looping over the same phrases. She lived simply, I presa. Simply. She didn't have much. You're lucky. Some estates are nightmares. Every time someone said it, I nodded again. Yeah? Someone mentioned sorting through her clothes. Another talked about donating dishes to the church kitchen. Someone else asked who would take the sewing machine. No one asked about accounts. No one asked about savings. Iamast, they're hastening first bushar person. On their face. I watched their faces as they spoke, earnest, gentle, tired. These weren't sharp people. They weren't cruel. They were repeating a story they believed, or one that had always been told. The letter felt heavier with every word. My cousin leaned close and whispered, at least there won't be lawyers. I smiled, but not with my eyes. I could hear my mother in the silence between sentences, not correcting anyone, not defending herself, just letting the room believe what it needed to. There was a moment, small, easy to miss, when my aunt looked at me again. Her eyes flicked to my coat pocket, then back to my face. Just a glance, probably nothing. But my stomach tightened. I wondered then if everyone really believed this, or if belief was simply easier than asking. My mother had always kept things close, not secretive, just contained. She didn't like attention on what she managed quietly. Pride made her uncomfortable. So did pity. Standing there, listening to people reduce her life to absence, I felt something shift inside me. Not anger. Not yet. Reculation. She had curated this ending as carefully as she curated everything else. The letter wasn't an accident. The silence wasn't either. I pressed my hand briefly against my pocket, just to feel the paper, to remind myself I hadn't imagined it. This wasn't a lie they were telling. It was a version she had allowed. When the crowd thinned, I stepped outside alone. Kaplaiza Chimporni Turnown, corn course. The cold hit hard clean. Snow sat untouched along the steps. The sky hung low and gray, like it didn't plan to clear. I breathed once. Then again. Inside my pocket, the letter stayed folded, patient, unspoken. I didn't correct anyone that day. I didn't say her name louder. I let the dust settle the way it always does. But as I walked to my car, I understood something I hadn't before. My mother hadn't just saved money. She had saved her truth for later, and somehow she'd left it with me. The house had its own sound when it was empty, not silence exactly, more like a careful listening. The refrigerator hummed low. The old window pane clicked when the wind leaned on it. Somewhere inside the walls, heat moved like a slow animal. Yeah. I walked from room to room with the bank letter folded in my hand, the paper warm from my palm. Yeah. Everywhere I looked, I saw her choices, small ones, quiet ones, the kind you don't notice until you're the only one left to notice them. And that number. It followed me like a second shadow. My mother lived like she was always bracing for winter, even in July, not fearful, just prepared. She measured flour twice, tapping the cup gently against the bowl so nothing wasted clung to the sides. She folded grocery bags and tucked them under the sink like they were worth saving, because, in her mind, they were. When she left a room, her hand always found the light switch. Click, off. Yeah, it wasn't a habit she made a show of. It was like breathing. I used to tease her when I was younger. Mom, it's not that serious. And she'd smile, the smallest smile, and say something like, it adds up. That was her language, not big speeches, not lessons, just small sentences that stayed. I stood in her kitchen now, looking at the corners she kept clean, the chairs she'd tightened with a screwdriver instead of replacing, the calendar still hung on the wall, with last month's squares crossed off. There was comfort in the order, and something unsettling too, because everything in this house said barely enough, and the letter said otherwise. I set it down on the counter, then I picked it up again. Like it might change if I looked away. I moved through the living room where she kept the furniture covered in soft throws that smelled faintly of cedar. The carpet had worn paths from years of careful walking, kitchen to chair, chair to hallway, hallway to bedroom, her life traced in quiet lines. On the mantel sat a candle burned down to a stub. She never threw those away. Still good, she'd say, and tuck them into a drawer for later. I opened that drawer now, half-melted candles, rubber bands, spare buttons in a teacup, a small roll of twine, a tiny screwdriver with the handle worn smooth, everything useful, everything kept. I heard her voice in my head, not loud, just present, don't toss it, you never know. In the hallway, her sewing basket sat where it always sat, near the window that got the best afternoon light. I lifted the lid, spools of thread arranged by color, needles stuck into a tomato pincushion. A measuring tape curled like a sleeping ribbon. At the bottom there was a sock. Gray, mended. The stitch line neat and steady. I held it carefully. It was such a small thing to keep, but it felt like holding her hand. I remembered her sitting by the window, winter light thin and blue on her fingers. The radio, low. The world outside frozen, but her hands moving patiently, as if time could be repaired. And still, nothing here looked like it belonged to someone with Bader Sus. Arbecht waiting quietly in a bank. I went to her bedroom and opened the closet. Her coats hung in a row, each one older than it should have been, each one brushed clean. The pockets still held little remnants of her days, tissues folded small, a single mitten, a receipt from the hardware store dated years ago. On the dresser sat her watch, stopped at the same time it had stopped months ago. She never replaced the battery. She said she didn't need to know the exact minute. I sat on the edge of her bed and unfolded the letter again. The paper looked wrong in this room. Too crisp, too confident. It didn't match the softness of her quilts or the tired shape of her slippers. I stared at the number until it stopped being a number and started becoming a question. Where did it come from? Savings didn't appear out of nowhere. They were built. Piece by piece. Did she take money out of every paycheck and hide it away like a prayer? Did she skip things she wanted so she could stack safety in silence? Was this her version of insurance against a world that never promised to be kind? I tried to imagine her younger, before I was born, before my father left, before the bills piled up. I realized I didn't know much about her life before she was mom. That was when something in me shifted again. Maybe the money wasn't the mystery. Maybe she was. The way she lived wasn't just frugal, it was careful. Like someone who learned early that security is something you build alone. Evening came early, the way it does in winter. The house dimmed slowly, one room at a time, until everything felt softer and farther away. I stood in the hallway and watched the last light thin out across the floorboards. I reached for the switch out of instinct. Click, the hall went dark. For a moment I just stood there, hand still on the wall, realizing how deeply her habits had moved into me. How the house still guided my body the way it guided hers. I slid the bank letter back into my pocket. It felt heavier now, not because of what it meant, but because of what it suggested. A life can look simple from the outside and still carry something hidden. As I walked back into the kitchen, I caught myself wondering, what else did she keep quiet? The bank hadn't changed, not really. Same brick face darkened by years of weather. Same narrow windows that never seemed to look out at anything. Same brass door handle worn smooth where thousands of hands had passed before mine. There were 3 tellers behind the counter. Only one was free. She looked up when I approached, her smile already practiced, already kind. "How can I help you today?" I slid the envelope across the counter, careful not to let my fingers linger on it. The paper felt thinner here, less important, like it had been waiting to be absorbed into the building. "I received this," I said. She nodded and asked for my ID. Her voice didn't change when she typed my mother's name into the computer. No raised eyebrow, no pause. Just familiarity. That unsettled me more than surprise would have. While she worked, I looked around. The waiting chairs were vinyl, cracked at the seams. A framed photo of the town from decades ago hung crooked on the wall. This place didn't rush. It didn't react. It simply held things, just like my mother. And the teller looked back at me and spoke gently, like she had done this before, maybe even with my mother. Yes, she said. The account is still active. "'Kay?" She turned the screen slightly, enough for me to see the name and the balance. The number looked the same here as it had at my kitchen table. Real unapologetic. I just wanted to confirm. I started, then stopped. Words felt unnecessary. She nodded again. "She's been coming in for years," she said. Always very polite, very brief. I waited for more. "She usually came early," the teller added, almost absent-mindedly. "Didn't like crowds?" That sounded right. "She never stayed long," she said. Knew exactly what she wanted. I imagined my mother standing where I stood now, hands folded, eyes down, saying thank you, leaving without a trace. No one else is listed on the account," the teller continued. Just her. Ew. The words landed softly but stayed. I asked a few questions, procedural ones. What would happen next? What paperwork I'd need? She answered without hesitation, her voice steady, unburdened by the weight I carried into the room. When she finished, she slid my ID back to me and waited patient. As if there was something more I might say. I wanted to ask why she never told me, and why she carried this alone, why silence felt safer than explanation, but the teller couldn't answer that. She only knew patterns, dates, transactions, facts. As I stood there, I realized something quietly devastating. My mother had been seen here, not as someone struggling, not as someone scraping by, but as someone steady, intentional, capable. She had lived 2 lives in parallel, one visible, one tucked away between brick walls and balance sheets. And she had chosen that separation carefully. I thought of all the times I'd asked her if she needed help. All the times she waved it off. "I'm fine," she'd say. She hadn't been lying. She just hadn't been explaining. The teller smiled at me again. Not the kind that invites conversation. The kind that closes it gently. I thanked her. My voice sounded steadier than I felt. As I turned to leave, I caught my reflection in the glass door. For a moment, I looked like her. Same posture. Same way of holding myself, like I didn't want to take up too much space. That was when it hit me. Silence wasn't absence. It was her language. Outside, the winter air cut sharp and clean into my lungs. I stood on the sidewalk and let it settle me. Cars passed. Someone laughed down the block. Life continued without pause. I looked back at the bank. From the outside, it gave nothing away. No hint of what it held, no sign of the quiet transactions that had happened there month after month. Just brick, glass, time. Rotaka. I slid my hands into my pockets and felt the empty space where the letter had been. It didn't feel empty anymore. As I walked away, I understood something I hadn't before. My mother didn't choose silence because she had nothing to say. She chose it because some things once spoken can never be taken back. And she had decided I wasn't meant to know yet. The house sounded different after the bank. Not louder, not quieter, just tighter, like it had drawn its shoulders in. I unlocked the door and stood there for a moment, key still in my hand, listening. The air inside felt held, the kind of stillness that waits to see what you'll do next. I stepped in and closed the door behind me. The click echoed longer than it should have. The table was right where she left it. Small, square, clean. I sat down slowly, like the chair might object if I moved too fast. This was where my mother paid her bills, always after dinner, always with the radio low. She'd lined things up just so, envelopes stacked, pen placed parallel to the edge of the table, glasses folded neatly beside her plate. She believed in order, not the loud kind, the quiet kind that doesn't need to be explained. I rested my hands on the table and let my fingers trace the faint grooves in the wood. Years of her careful movements lived there, sliding papers forward, pulling them back, folding corners flat. Yet the house smelled like dust and lemon cleaner, familiar, almost comforting. I opened the first drawer, envelopes, sorted by year, each one labeled in her small, steady handwriting, utility bills, insurance notices, notes from the clinic. Nothing loose, nothing hurried. The second drawer held receipts, folded cleanly into thirds, no crumples, no scribbles. She'd kept them the way some people keep photographs. I felt my chest tighten, not with sadness exactly, but with recognition. This was her language. If she had something to say, she put it in order, and yet there was nothing here about the money. No note, no explanation, no in case, just silence arranged carefully. I pulled out a folder with Straeska. I pulled out a folder marked important and opened it slowly. I mentioned sambanat and no me. Say to were documents I already expects. Inside were documents I already expected, deed to the house, warranty papers for appliances she'd owned longer than me, a faded insurance card, everything necessary, nothing extra. I flipped through each page, waiting for something to fall out, a letter tucked between forms, a folded page written in that careful hand, nothing. I checked the folder again, slower this time, still nothing. The absence felt deliberate. I leaned back in the chair and looked around the kitchen. The clock above the fridge ticked on, faithful. The sink was dry, the counters clear. Even grief hadn't managed to disrupt her system. That was when the thought settled in. She had planned for everything, except my questions. Yeah. I pictured her sitting here alone at night, lamp casting a soft circle over the table. The rest of the house dark, papers moving beneath her hands, decisions being made without witnesses. Did she pause sometimes? Did she ever think of leaving something behind that explained it all? Or did she believe explanations weakened what she was trying to protect? The house didn't answer. It just watched. I stood and walked down the hallway, my steps slow, deliberate. The floor creaked like it remembered her weight and was surprised by mine. In her bedroom, the bed was made tight, corners tucked in clean, pillows smoothed flat. She'd never liked wrinkles. Said they made things look unfinished. On the dresser sat a small box. I opened it carefully. Inside were keepsakes. Ords. A pressed flower, a photo of me as a child, bent at the edges. A note written by my father years before he disappeared from our lives. She had kept that. So she wasn't against sentiment. She just chose it selectively. I sat on the edge of the bed and held the photo for a moment. Her restraint hadn't been cold. It had been intentional. She didn't leave instructions because she trusted process. She didn't leave explanations because she trusted time. Kim, the money wasn't meant to be found emotionally. It was meant to be discovered practically. That realization landed quietly, but firmly. She hadn't prepared me to understand her. She had prepared me to handle what came next, and maybe she believed that was enough. Back in the kitchen, I closed every drawer the way she would have, slowly making sure nothing caught. I straightened the chair, smoothed the table with my palm. The house felt smaller now. Not because anything was gone, but because there was more inside it than before. Unsaid things have weight. I stood there a moment longer, listening to the clock, the hum of the fridge, the quiet persistence of a life that had been carefully contained. I understood then that her restraint wasn't withholding, it was protection, for herself, and maybe for me. As I turned off the light and stepped out of the room, one thought stayed with me. She had ordered everything perfectly, and left me to find the truth on my own. The phone felt heavier than it should have. Not in my hand, but in what it asked of me. I stood by the kitchen window, watching a thin line of snow slide off the neighbor's roof. It fell quietly, like it didn't want credit for the sound it made. The house was still, too still. I waited for the clock to finish its minute before dialing. I don't know why. When the call connected, I already knew the answer wouldn't come easily. Some questions don't want to be spoken. They just want to be heard. I hadn't planned on calling anyone that morning, but the quiet had started to feel crowded. The house held everything in, my mother's order, her silence, her habits, and now it was holding my questions too. They sat in corners, on shelves, inside drawers I'd already closed. My aunt was the first number I chose. Not because she was closest, because she was the one who always knew something. Well, she'd been there during the hard years, the years my father disappeared quietly and never quite returned. The years when money was spoken about in half sentences and sighs. I stared at the phone while it rang. One ring too. I could already picture her kitchen, the hum of appliances, the chair she liked by the counter. I wondered if she was holding the phone the way I was, pressed close, careful. Canked. When she answered, her voice was exactly the same as it always was. Hello? No concern, no warning, just normal. I didn't ease into it. Did you know I asked that Mom had a savings account? There it was, silence. Silence. Not the kind where the line drops, the kind where someone is still there, but choosing. I could hear her breathing, slow, controlled, like she was counting something that wasn't numbers. No, she said finally. And just one word. It wasn't sharp, it wasn't defensive, it was tired. Oh, I said, not because I was convinced. Because there was nowhere else to go. I told her the amount, not all at once. I broke it apart. Gave it space. She didn't interrupt. When I finished, there was another pause. Shorter this time. Well, she said. I didn't know about that. Still no question. No, are you okay? No, that's surprising. Just the information acknowledged. Filed away, we talked for another minute. About paperwork. About how things get complicated. About how my mother always kept things close to the chest. She was private, my aunt said. You are. You know that. Yeah, I did know that, but privacy and secrecy don't always mean the same thing. When we hung up, I sat there with the phone still in my hand, listening to the quiet dial tone fill the room. I called 2 more people that afternoon. The responses were nearly identical. A pause, a denial, a tone that suggested this was inconvenient. No one sounded shocked, no one sounded curious. One cousin laughed lightly, the way people do when something unsettles them but they don't want to admit it. Well, I'll be, she said. Your mom always surprised people. Yo cow. Another relative said, that must be a lot to deal with, and quickly shifted the conversation to logistics. What no one said stayed with me longer than what they did. No one asked how it felt. No one asked what it meant. Stida. They talked around the money like it was a loose object on the floor, something to step over carefully so no one tripped. I started to understand then. The money wasn't the uncomfortable part. What it represented was, it challenged the version of my mother they were comfortable with. The modest one, the struggling one, the one who fit neatly into their understanding of the family story. Money like that rewrites things. It suggests discipline. Independence, choices made quietly, and maybe they didn't want to know how much she had endured without saying a word. By evening, the phone sat untouched on the counter. I didn't feel like calling anyone else. Outside, the light faded early, dragging the day down with it. I turned on the lamp by instinct and watched its circle stretch across the wall. For no, I thought about how silence travels, how it passes from one person to another, how it becomes shared without being acknowledged. My mother had carried her silence carefully. Now it sat with me, not as a burden, but as a question. I realized then that no one was afraid of the money itself. They were afraid of what it might say about her and what it might ask of them. I turned off the lamp and let the room go dark. Some answers don't come when you ask. They come when you stop expecting others to give them to you. The calendar fell open by accident. I didn't mean to look at it. I was reaching for a folder on the shelf when it slid forward, landing face down on the table with a soft papery sound. I left it there for a moment, then I turned it over. The dates were filled in lightly, pencil marks faded but careful, appointments, birthdays, weather notes. And then, one word written again and again in the same small corner of each page, bank. That was when the quiet changed. My mother kept calendars the way she kept everything else. Methodical, restrained, meant only for her. She never tore pages out, never circled things dramatically, just small notes tucked neatly where they wouldn't draw attention. I sat at the table with the calendar open in front of me, the house breathing around me. The refrigerator hummed, the clock ticked. Outside, a truck passed slowly, tires hissing against cold pavement. January, February, March. There it was again. Same word, same corner, same handwriting. Bank once a month, every month. Every month! I reached for another calendar from the shelf, then other, for another calendar from the shelf, then another different year, same pattern. It felt like listening to footsteps you hadn't noticed before, until you realized they'd always been there. Yeah, my mother never talked about routines. She just lived them, woke early, ate simply, paid bills on the same night every week. Habits stacked quietly on top of each other until they became a life. I traced one of the penciled words with my finger. The graphite had pressed just enough to leave a faint groove in the paper. This wasn't casual, it was intentional. I spread the calendars across the table, years unfolding like a long, quiet road. The word never changed. No variations. No explanations, just bank. I imagined her writing it, standing at the counter, glasses low on her nose, pencil sharpened just enough. Marking the day without ceremony, not deposit, not savings, not account, just the place. As if naming it more would make it dangerous. I thought back to all the times she left the house mid-morning, coat buttoned, purse tucked close. She'd say she was running an errand or heading out for a bit. I never asked where, she never volunteered. At the time it felt normal, ordinary, the kind of independence you don't question until it leaves a shape behind. Now I could see it. The consistency, the discipline, saving wasn't something she stumbled into. It wasn't leftover money accumulating by chance. It was something she chose again and again, quietly, steadily, without applause. The money wasn't hidden in fear, it was protected by routine. I sat back in my chair and let the calendars rest where they were. The pattern was unmistakable now. This wasn't secrecy, it was structure. She hadn't hidden the money from the world. Banks aren't hidden places. Ledgers exist to be found, records are meant to last. What she'd hidden it from was conversation. I thought about the house I grew up in, the years after my father left, the way money tightened the air, the way questions led to arguments, the way explanations invited opinions, and opinions invited pressure. I remembered her telling me once, when I was older and struggling myself, not everyone needs to know everything. At the time, I thought she meant privacy. Now I understood she meant survival. Silence wasn't just safer. It was lighter. She carried her plans without burdening anyone else with them, without inviting judgment, without asking permission. And who taught her that? Her parents, maybe, or life itself. The kind that doesn't forgive mistakes loudly, but punishes them quietly. I realized then that the money wasn't a secret she was ashamed of. It was a boundary she had drawn. I stacked the calendars carefully and slid them back onto the shelf, keeping them in order. The way she would have wanted. The word bank stayed with me long after the pages were closed. One small note, repeated faithfully, a lifetime of intention written in pencil. King, the house felt different now. Not smaller, not heavier, just clearer. Like a fog had lifted from something that had always been there. My mother hadn't lived accidentally. She had lived deliberately. And as I stood there alone in her quiet house, I wondered who had taught her that silence could be a kind of strength. And what else she had learned, without ever saying a word, the memory came back while I was washing dishes. Not all at once, just a sound at first. My father's voice, lowered. My mother's answer, even lower. Words pressed thin so they wouldn't travel down the hallway. The water ran too hot. I didn't turn it down. I stood there with my hands in the sink, staring at the faded pattern on the plate, realizing how long some silences live inside you before you notice them again. Some things don't disappear, they wait. When I was a child, money had a sound. It wasn't coins or bills. It was tension. The pause before someone spoke. The careful way doors were closed. Madekost. The way laughter stopped just a second too soon. And my father brought debts into the house the way storms bring wind, loud at first, then lingering. Bills arrived folded sharply, their edges like warnings. My mother would open them at the table after I was supposed to be asleep. I knew because I could hear the chair move, I could hear paper slide. Arguments happened after bedtime, always whispered. Always unfinished. My mother never raised her voice. She didn't need to. Silence did the work for her. I remember lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, counting the seconds between their voices. Learning early that money didn't just buy things, it asked for things, loyalty, patience, pieces of yourself. Eventually, my father left quietly, like something unpaid that just stops coming back. After that, money became something else in our house, not dangerous, but not friendly or friendly either. My mother stopped talking about it altogether, not out of shame, out of control. I dried my hands and sat down at the table, the memory settling in beside me like an old guest. I could see her clearly now, my mother learning that money attracts people needs, expectations, the kind that don't leave once they're acknowledged. Ka? Fi and Kang. I thought about relatives who always knew when someone had a little extra. Neighbors who asked for favors that came with invisible price tags. Friends who smiled differently once circumstances changed. My mother watched all of that, she learned. She learned that once people know what you have, they start deciding what you owe. I remembered times when she'd deflect questions easily. "You doing okay?" someone would ask. "Oh, we're fine," she'd say, and she meant it because fine to her didn't require explanation. Okay. The savings account wasn't a lifeline for others. It wasn't meant to rescue anyone. It wasn't generosity withheld. It was autonomy protected. She hadn't saved to be admired. She hadn't saved to be needed. She had saved so she wouldn't have to ask. That realization sat heavy, but steady, like something finally settling into place. I thought about the moment she could have told me there were plenty when I struggled, when I was tired. When I said, half joking, "I don't know how you did it on your own," she would smile. Not sadly, not proudly. "Just enough, you manage," she'd say. At the time, I thought she was talking about strength. Now I understood she was talking about boundaries. She didn't tell me because once I knew I might carry it for her. Worry, plan, adjust my life around a number that was never meant to be a burden. She had lived long enough knowing what it felt like to be responsible for someone else's financial fear. She didn't want that for me. The silence wasn't secrecy, it was mercy. She let me believe she had less so I wouldn't feel like I owed her more. That thought broke something open in my chest, but gently, like light through a door left ajar. That night, I sat alone in the living room with only one lamp on. The rest of the house stayed dark, respectful. I imagined her there with me. Quiet, hands folded, eyes steady. Not explaining, not apologizing, just trusting me to understand when the time came the account wasn't her final statement. It was her final protection, for herself and for me. I turned off the lamp and let the room return to shadow. Some truths aren't meant to be shared early. They're meant to arrive when you're strong enough to carry them, without asking for anything in return. The first check I wrote in my mother's name felt like borrowing her handwriting. The pen moved across the paper slowly, as if it needed permission. Outside the window, the morning was gray and soft, the kind that blurs the edges of things. The house was quiet again, quiet in that familiar, watchful way. I paused before signing, not because I didn't know what to do, but because I could almost feel her standing behind me the way she used to when I was learning, careful, patient. Expecting me to do it right. The number didn't make me feel rich. It didn't make me want to buy anything. It didn't spark plans or daydreams. It did something stranger. It made me feel known. As if my mother had been speaking to me, along in a language I'd never learned to listen for. Receipts means quiet discipline. The account wasn't a surprise gift. It was proof of who she'd been when no one was looking. People had talked about her like she was fragile, like she survived by luck and hand-me-downs. Like her life had been small because it had to be, but the money told a different story. Not a glamorous one, a steady one. It reframed her in my mind, not as someone who barely made it, but as someone who chose her steps carefully and never needed applause for the distance she traveled. I sat at the table where she paid bills, spreading the envelopes out the way she used to. The edges were worn, her handwriting still crisp. And for the first time, I didn't feel like I was cleaning up after her. I felt like I was finishing something she started. I started with the bills. Not because anyone told me to, but because that was what she would have done first. The utilities, the property tax, the last medical statement folded into thirds like the others. Nothing dramatic. Just life reduced to paper. I called each number, waded through hold music that sounded too cheerful, and spoke softly to strangers who didn't know her name meant anything to me. "Yes," said Kuffer Neinzeig Sufdasa Peniseftatari. "Yes," I'd say. I'm handling her account. I didn't say she was my mother. I didn't say I still half expect her to pick up the phone herself. I wrote checks. Heck how. I mailed them in plain envelopes. I kept the stubs. After that, I walked outside and stood on the porch. The porch had always been slightly wrong. One board bowed near the step, and the railing wobbled if you leaned on it. My mother knew. She had known for years. But she never fixed it, not because she didn't care, because she prioritized. And because she understood the difference between urgent and cosmetic. Still, I could hear her saying it the way she used to kinda watch that board. "Kia." I stepped down carefully and crouched by the rotten edge, pressing my finger into the soft wood. It gave way too easily. It was time. "No," I said. She didn't. I waited for questions, for disbelief, for someone to tell me I must be mistaken. None came. They were adjusting, not to the money, but to the version of my mother they hadn't known. What struck me most wasn't what they said, it was what they didn't. No one asked why she kept it quiet. No one apologized for assuming she'd had nothing. No one admitted they might have misunderstood her. And they sat with the information like people who had just learned the floor beneath them was sturdier than they thought. Uncomfortable, but not unsafe. I realized then that the money had never been the secret. The secret was her independence. The fact that she didn't need rescuing, didn't need managing, didn't need commentary. That kind of independence unsettles people, especially families built on shared struggle and mutual visibility. My mother had opted out of that part, curtly. She hadn't hidden because she was ashamed. She had hidden because she didn't want her life negotiated by committee. As I stood there, looking at their faces, I understood something else too. They weren't angry, they were recalibrating. And maybe that was harder. When the conversation shifted, slowly, carefully, I reached for my coat. No one stopped me. Outside, the air was cold and clean, the kind that clears your lungs if you let it. I stood on the porch for a moment, listening to the muffled sounds inside, voices resuming, plates clinking, life continuing. The silence I carried with me felt different now, not heavy, honest. I walked to my car and sat there without starting it, hands resting on the wheel. My mother had spoken the truth in the only way she trusted, through consistency, through restraint, through a life that didn't ask for permission. As I pulled away from the curb, one question stayed with me. Would they ever understand that what she left behind wasn't money, but proof that she belonged only to herself? The cookbook opened to the same page it always did. Not because I meant to, but because it remembered her hands. The spine creaked softly, like an old door that doesn't fully forget. Flour dust lived in the seams. A faint stain darkened the corner of the paper, where she must have set a spoon down years ago and never worried about it again. I slid the bank letter out of my pocket and folded it one more time. Smaller, neater, then tucked it between those pages. It didn't look like a secret there. It looked like something she'd planned to be found. Her kitchen was quieter now, but not empty. The house still held her patterns, light switches turned off out of habit, drawers closed gently, chairs pushed back in careful lines. Even my footsteps changed when I walked through it, slower, softer, as if the floor might be sensitive. After the bank and the paperwork and the conversations that never went as deep as I hoped, I stopped feeling like a headline. It became a number that belonged to a system, forms and signatures, dates and confirmations. But my mother didn't live inside a system. She lived inside small choices. The way she folded towels so the edges lined up perfectly. The way she saved rubber bands in a jar because they'll come in handy. The way she rinsed a paper plate and left it to dry, not out of desperation, but out of principle. I had spent years thinking she was merely getting by. Now I knew she was building something, not loudly, not to impress anyone, just steadily, like a person stacking wood for winter even when the sky is still blue. When I held that letter, I didn't feel lucky. I felt seen, not by the bank, by her. I tried to cook one of her recipes that afternoon, not because I was hungry, but because the house felt too still without some small task moving through it. Chicken and dumplings, simple, ordinary. Cake. Her handwriting was in the margins, tiny notes that weren't instructions so much as reminders. Don't rush the onions. Kang. Add water if it looks thick. Let it sit before serving. I moved through the steps slowly, listening to the soft sounds, knife against cutting board, water filling a pot, the low hiss when heat met oil. The window above the sink glowed with late-day light, pale and tired. While the broth simmered, I opened a cabinet and found her old aprons stacked in a neat pile. The top one was faded, the fabric worn thin at the waist. I held it to my chest for a second longer than necessary. I went to the hardware store that afternoon, what to Spain and Ferdol. I went to the hardware store that afternoon. The bell above the door jingled when I walked in, and the smell of lumber and metal hit me like memory. My mother used to come here for small things, screws by the pound, sandpaper, a hinge instead of a new cabinet. The clerk asked if I needed help, and I shook my head. I didn't trust my voice yet. Outside, I laid new boards across the porch like I was laying something to rest. The hammer felt solid in my hand. Each nail sank with a dull, honest sound. The work was simple, but it demanded attention. Halfway through, I stopped and looked at the house. Okay. From this angle, I could see the kitchen window where she used to stand in the mornings. The curtain moved slightly with the heat inside. For a moment, it felt like she might appear there, holding a dish towel, watching quietly, not judging, just witnessing. Hinak, that's when it hit me, clear as cold air. Kalakin. The money wasn't her way of giving me a new life. It was her way of making sure I didn't inherit her hardship. Max. So I could repair what she couldn't get to. So I could close the loose ends without fear. Yeah. And the strangest part was I wasn't spending it like it was mine. I was moving it the way she would have, slowly, deliberately, with respect. And by evening, the porch felt steady under my feet. The railing didn't wobble anymore. The board sat straight and clean, like they'd always belonged there. I carried a box of her old clothes to the car. Things she would have wanted gone. Worn sweaters. Shoes past their prime. A coat that still smelled faintly of her perfume and winter air. At the donation center, I set the box down gently, like it contained something breakable. The attendant thanked me without looking up. Driving back, my hands stayed on the wheel in the same position my mother used. 10 and 2. Steady, careful. The money hadn't made my world bigger, it had made my mother clearer. And as the house came into view again, porch light glowing soft in the dusk, I found myself wondering, was this what she hoped I'd do? Not spend it, but finish what she held together quietly for so long. The question came the way it always does, casual, almost careless. We were standing in my aunt's living room, coats half on, conversations already drifting toward the door. Someone asked if there was anything else to settle, anything left undone. I looked at the carpet while the words found their shape. The pattern was worn thin near the couch, like it had listened to this family for years. Gammon, Irix, Mike too. When I looked up, every face was waiting, so I told the truth. We hadn't gathered for anything official. Just coffee, leftovers, the slow unstacking of grief into something manageable. Eckhout, smelled like reheated food. The house smelled like reheated food and winter coats drying by the vent. Familiar. Safe. The kind of place where hard things are usually softened before they're spoken. And my relatives sat in their usual places, my aunt near the window, my cousin on the arm of the chair, phone face down in her hand. Someone had turned the television off without realizing it, leaving the room quieter than expected. Countess turned. I stood near the doorway, keys in my pocket, already halfway gone. That's when the question landed. So, my uncle said, clearing his throat, is there anything else we need to take care of? Yeah, it wasn't asked with suspicion, it wasn't sharp, it was practical. Habitual. The kind of question families ask when they believe everything has already been decided. I felt my mother then, not like a memory, but like a presence, steady, observant, saying nothing I could have kept quiet. I had practiced silence my whole life, but something in me shifted. There is, I said. My voice sounded calm. That surprised me. I told them about the account. Not dramatically, not all at once. I kept my hands still. I didn't embellish, just facts. The room changed in small ways. Someone blinked too slowly. Someone else adjusted in their seat. My aunt's hand tightened around her mug, though she didn't lift it. No one interrupted, no one laughed, the silence stretched. Not hostile, not warm, just real. That doesn't sound like her, someone said finally. Not accusing, just confused. I nodded. I know, I said. I told them how long it had been there, how quietly it had been built, how nothing about her daily life suggested it. She never said anything, my cousin murmured. The smell was faint, laundry soap and something warm. The dumplings turned out uneven, too thick in some places. Too soft in others. I laughed quietly at that, the sound surprising me. She would have smiled, not proudly, not critically, just kindly. I sat at the table alone and ate slowly, letting the steam fog my glasses the way it used to when she served dinner. The food tasted like memory, but it also tasted like time. When I finished, I didn't rush to clean up. I stayed at the table and looked around, letting my eyes rest on the details I used to overlook. The crack above the doorway. The small scratch on the table's edge where I once dragged a chair too hard as a child. The way the curtain hem was stitched slightly crooked because she did it herself, and perfection wasn't always worth the effort. I realized then that the money wasn't proof of her life. Her life was the proof. The letter was just paper. What mattered was how she moved through the world, quietly, intentionally. Without asking permission to be steady, she didn't leave that account so people would praise her. She didn't leave it so relatives would change their story about her. She didn't even leave it so I would feel secure in the flashy way people imagine security. She left it as an extension of her discipline, a final act of care that didn't require conversation. I thought about how many times I'd mistaken her silence for weakness. How I'd offered help as if she were barely holding on, when the truth was, she was holding herself together better than anyone knew. She wasn't fragile, she was resolved, and she never needed anyone to clap for it. That night I washed the pot and dried it slowly, the way she would have. I turned off the kitchen light and stood for a moment in the dim hallway, letting the house settle. And before I went to bed, I opened the cookbook again and checked the letter. Still there, tucked between the pages, safe in plain sight. I closed the book gently and placed it back on the shelf. Outside, snow began to fall in small, quiet pieces. The porch light caught it briefly, then let it disappear into darkness. I understood then that what remained wasn't the money. What remained was her way of standing in the world, steady, quiet, prepared. And maybe that was the inheritance she trusted me to find. Only once I was ready to carry it without asking why.